What if I told you a simple flight turned into a nightmare, where a man was kicked off a plane for no reason? And what happened next left the airline shaking in its boots. Stick around, because this isn't just a story about one passenger. It's a story about a giant corporation that tried to cover up the truth. And the revenge that followed, it'll leave you speechless. Before we start the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more. It was just another ordinary morning when Charles Williams, a well-dressed man in his early 30s, boarded his flight from Atlanta to New York. He had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. Everything was set. He had his boarding pass in hand, his seat was confirmed, and there was no reason to think this would be anything but a smooth journey. As he found his seat in the economy section, he settled down, buckled his seatbelt, and prepared for the flight. But what happened next was something no one, especially Charles, had expected. The plane had barely left the ground when the flight attendant, Sarah, walked down the aisle and stopped right in front of him. Without a word of greeting, she simply looked at Charles and said, "Sir, you need to move to the back of the plane." Confused, Charles raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry, what do you mean? I'm in my assigned seat." Sarah's eyes didn't soften. "You need to move to the back, it's for operational reasons." Her tone was firm, cold, almost dismissive. Charles glanced around, unsure of what was going on. He had never experienced anything like this before. He was being asked to leave his seat for no clear reason at all. But he wasn't the type to make a scene. "I'm sorry, but I really don't understand," he said calmly, trying to keep his voice steady. Sarah didn't explain. She simply repeated the same demand, now sounding more forceful. "Move to the back of the plane." At this point, Charles was starting to feel uncomfortable. His mind raced. Why was he being singled out? There was no one else on the plane being asked to move. "What's going on?" he asked again, but Sarah just stared at him, unblinking. Not wanting to cause trouble, Charles finally stood up. He felt a growing sense of unease, but he thought maybe there had been some mistake. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. He grabbed his bag and started walking down the aisle, though still unsure of why he was being asked to leave his seat. As he made his way toward the back of the plane, he noticed passengers staring at him. Some seemed confused, others didn't even look up from their books or phones. It was strange, like no one knew what was really happening, but Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He reached the back of the plane and stood there awkwardly, trying to figure out what to do next. Was he supposed to just wait back there? He turned around to see if Sarah had any further instructions, but she was already walking away, back down the aisle as if nothing had happened. He was left standing in the cramped space, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Then, just a few moments later, 2 security guards approached him. They didn't say much, but their body language was clear. They were there to escort him off the plane. Charles felt his stomach drop. He couldn't believe what was happening. This wasn't just a seat issue anymore. He was being thrown off the plane. "Wait, what's going on? Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice shaky now. The security guards didn't answer, but one of them gestured toward the door, signaling for him to follow. The passengers around him began to murmur, some looking over their shoulders, others just quietly watching the scene unfold. Charles had never felt more humiliated. He was being escorted off a flight like a criminal, and yet no one seemed to know why. He looked back at the cabin, trying to catch Sarah's eye, but she was already out of sight. No explanation, no apology, just the cold, hard reality that he was being removed from the plane. But as he walked toward the door, Charles made a silent vow. This wasn't over. He knew he had to do something. He wasn't going to let this go. As Charles stepped off the plane and onto the tarmac, he couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief. His mind raced with a mix of confusion and anger. How could this happen? He'd done nothing wrong. He was just a paying passenger, following the rules like everyone else. Why had he been singled out? And why hadn't the flight attendant explained anything to him? The questions kept spinning in his head, each one more frustrating than the last. But the most pressing thought was that he couldn't just walk away from this. He couldn't let the airline get away with treating him like this. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number of his lawyer. The phone rang only once before it clicked to voicemail. He hung up, then quickly dialed again. But this time he got an answer. "Charles, what happened?" his lawyer asked, sensing the urgency in his voice. "They kicked me off the plane. They said it was for operational reasons, but no one would explain what that meant. I didn't do anything wrong, but they still made me leave." "It was humiliating," Charles explained, his voice tight with frustration. His lawyer paused for a moment before speaking again. "I'm sorry, Charles. That's unacceptable. But listen, don't do anything hasty. I need you to hold tight. I'll get in touch with the airline right now and see what we can do. We're going to take action, I promise." Charles felt a small sense of relief. His lawyer wasn't the type to back down, and he knew if anyone could make this right, it would be him. But Charles also knew that this was bigger than just him. This wasn't just about getting an apology or a refund. He couldn't let what had happened go unnoticed. This was about standing up for himself, and standing up for everyone who had ever been mistreated or unfairly targeted. He took a deep breath and turned back toward the gate. A couple of ground crew members were watching him, but no one said anything. Charles was starting to feel the weight of the situation settle in. His heart was still pounding, but now it was mixed with a new feeling: resolve. He was determined to make things right, no matter how difficult it was. The moment he walked into the terminal, Charles pulled up the airline's social media pages. He knew the power of the internet. A single tweet could reach thousands, even millions of people in an instant. His fingers hovered over the screen as he thought about what to say. He wanted to make it clear that he wasn't just complaining. This wasn't a petty issue. This was about justice. He typed out a short message, one that he hoped would get the attention of the right people. "Just got kicked off my flight for no reason. This is unacceptable and feels like discrimination. I was treated unfairly. Off airline name, Jack's unjust treatment." He hit send and watched as the tweet was posted. The weight of the words felt heavy, but also empowering. It was a step toward getting the truth out there. Charles didn't know it yet, but that tweet would change everything. Within minutes, Charles began to feel the rush of his tweet gaining traction. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, and before he knew it, his tweet had gone viral. Comments poured in from all directions, some in support, others questioning what had really happened, and a few just sharing their own stories of similar experiences. But it wasn't just random people responding. News outlets began to pick up the story. First, a local station in Atlanta retweeted his post. Then a major news outlet in New York. The media storm was beginning, and Charles couldn't believe how quickly it had snowballed. His lawyer was in constant contact, giving him updates and instructions. But Charles couldn't stop thinking about how quickly everything was escalating. His phone rang again, and it was the airline's customer service. They had seen his tweet and wanted to resolve the issue as soon as possible. But Charles wasn't interested in a quick resolution. He wasn't going to settle for an apology and a flight voucher. He had no intention of letting this go quietly. "Mr. Williams, we sincerely apologize for the inconvenience," the customer service representative said, their tone almost robotic. "We understand your frustration, and we would like to offer you compensation for the inconvenience caused." Charles could hear the scripted nature of the response, and it made him more frustrated. "I don't want compensation," he interrupted. "I want to know why I was removed from the plane. I want to know why I was treated like that. What was the reason? Why was I singled out?" There was a long pause on the other end. Charles could practically hear the representative scrambling for an answer. Finally, they spoke again, but the explanation was vague at best. "We're looking into the matter internally, Mr. Williams. We don't have a full understanding of what happened, but we assure you that we are investigating it." Charles was furious. The more they spoke, the more it felt like they were brushing him off. He wasn't interested in vague reassurances. He wasn't interested in being treated like just another customer complaint. This wasn't about money. It was about respect and justice. "I've already tweeted about this, and the whole world is watching now," he said, his voice growing cold. You'd better do more than investigate. You need to fix this, and I'm not going to stop until I get some real answers." He ended the call and stared at his phone, feeling a mix of satisfaction and determination. The tweet had done exactly what he wanted it to, put the spotlight on the airline. But now, he had a new challenge ahead of him. The attention was only the beginning. He knew that to get real justice, he'd have to fight for it. And he wasn't backing down. In the hours that followed, the backlash against the airline grew. People began sharing their own stories of mistreatment by flight attendants, some with similar experiences, others with different but equally disturbing accounts of being unfairly targeted. The hashtag #unjust treatment was trending nationwide. The story had gone from a personal frustration to a public outcry. But Charles wasn't done yet. He knew that he had to make sure the airline felt the pressure. If he could get enough people involved, enough public scrutiny, he could make them pay attention. Really pay attention. He wasn't going to let them hide behind vague apologies. It was time to turn up the heat. As the day wore on, the media coverage intensified. Charles's tweet had now made its way to national news, and the airline's social media accounts were flooded with angry comments and retweets. Journalists reached out for interviews, wanting to hear Charles's side of the story. It seemed like everyone wanted to know more. He had gone from just a disgruntled passenger to the face of something much bigger, a symbol of people being mistreated and silenced. But with the spotlight shining on him, Charles knew he couldn't stop there. He had the momentum now, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. The airline might be scrambling to save face, but Charles had one more card to play. He'd made his statement on social media, but now it was time to take things to the next level. He had to make sure they understood the full impact of what they had done. Around 5 p.m., Charles received another call, this time from the airline's corporate office. The representative on the other end of the line sounded far more sincere than the previous one. "Mr. Williams, thank you for your patience. I want to apologize again for the situation. We've reviewed the incident, and we agree that the treatment you received was unacceptable. We are taking immediate action." Charles raised an eyebrow. "What kind of action?" "We are launching an internal investigation into the actions of the flight crew. Additionally, the flight attendant involved, Sarah, has been suspended pending the results of the investigation. We'll be in touch with you soon to discuss compensation for your inconvenience." Charles wasn't surprised by the news. He had expected them to say something like that. But the more they spoke, the more he realized it wasn't about the suspension or the compensation. It was about making sure the airline felt the consequences of their actions, not just handing out a few free miles and hoping people would forget. "I don't want compensation. I don't want your miles," he said firmly. "I want accountability. I want to know why this happened and how you plan to prevent it in the future. And I want to make sure this doesn't just get swept under the rug like so many other stories do." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "We understand, Mr. Williams. We will ensure that the situation is fully addressed and that proper actions are taken. We'll be in touch with you within the next 24 hours to discuss the next steps." Charles wasn't satisfied. He knew the airline was trying to save face, but the reality was, this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been unfairly treated. He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, still processing everything that had happened. It was clear that his tweet had shaken things up, but Charles wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The next morning, Charles received a message that would change everything. A former flight attendant had reached out to him privately, claiming to have information that would expose even more about the airline's practices. The message was simple, but its implications were huge. "They've done this before. You're not the first." Charles read the message twice, trying to absorb its meaning. He had known something wasn't right with the way he was treated, but now it seemed there was a pattern of behavior. This wasn't an isolated incident. He had stumbled upon something bigger, something the airline didn't want the public to know. With this new information, Charles knew he couldn't back down now. The fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Charles sat quietly, staring at the message for a long moment, his mind racing. They've done this before. You're not the first. The words echoed in his head, each one making the situation feel even more sinister. His instinct was to reach out immediately to the former flight attendant who had sent the message, but he knew he needed to be careful. This wasn't just a personal fight anymore. It had become something bigger. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer. "I need you to listen to this," Charles said as soon as the call was answered, his voice low and serious. After a quick explanation of the message, he sent it over to his lawyer. There was a tense silence on the other end before his lawyer spoke again, his tone now heavy with concern. "If what you're saying is true, this could be far more serious than a single act of discrimination. We might be dealing with a systemic issue at the airline. We need to dig deeper." Charles felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't considered the possibility that this wasn't just an isolated incident. If there were others like him, people who had been unfairly targeted or mistreated, then he had a chance to expose a real problem. He felt a fire reignite inside him. This wasn't just about a tweet anymore. This was about exposing the truth. That evening, Charles arranged a meeting with the former flight attendant who had reached out. They met at a cafe in a quiet part of town. The woman, whose name was Lisa, looked nervous. She was in her late 20s, and her hands fidgeted as she took a sip of her coffee. It was clear that she had hesitated before reaching out, but now that she was here, there was a sense of urgency in her eyes. "I wasn't sure if I should contact you at first," Lisa began, her voice shaky. "But after I saw what happened to you, I knew I had to. The thing is, this isn't the first time something like this has happened. The airline has a history of discriminating against certain passengers. It's not just isolated to you. And it's not just about race, it's about certain people being treated differently because of who they are." Charles leaned forward, his mind already processing what she was saying. "How do you know this? What's really going on?" Lisa looked around the cafe, making sure no one was paying attention to them. She lowered her voice. "I used to work for the airline. I've seen it firsthand. Passengers, particularly people of color, are often singled out for minor issues that don't apply to everyone. It's like the staff is trained to be suspicious of certain types of passengers, even when there's no reason for it." Charles couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had suspected something wasn't right, but hearing it from someone who had worked there, someone who had seen it firsthand, made it all the more real. The airline wasn't just a business, it was a system that enabled this kind of treatment. And that made it even more dangerous. I've heard stories about passengers being unfairly removed from flights, about people being treated differently, even when they followed all the rules. But no one ever speaks up. Everyone is too afraid to lose their jobs," Lisa continued. "And when incidents like yours happen, they're usually brushed under the rug. They apologize, offer compensation, and hope people forget about it. But this time I think it's different." Charles sat back, trying to process everything Lisa had just told him. The pieces were starting to fall into place. It wasn't just about his own experience. It was about the experiences of so many others who had been mistreated and silenced. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't be just another person who walked away after getting a half-hearted apology and a voucher. "I need you to help me expose this," Charles said, his voice firm. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen again, and we need to make sure people know what's really going on. If you're willing, I want you to be a part of this. Speak out, testify, whatever it takes." Lisa hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting nervously around the cafe. But after a few seconds, she nodded. "I'll do it. I've seen too much to stay silent anymore." The two of them sat in silence for a moment, both of them realizing that they were about to take on something much bigger than they had initially imagined. Charles knew there would be consequences. There always were when you stood up to something as powerful as an airline. But he also knew this was the right thing to do. He wasn't going to stop until the truth came out. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. Charles and Lisa worked quickly to gather evidence, speaking in hushed tones and keeping their plans tight. They knew they had to move carefully. The airline was no stranger to media attention, and if they were too obvious, they risked getting shut down before they even got started. Lisa helped Charles get access to some internal documents that revealed a troubling pattern. Emails and memos about complaints from passengers who had been unjustly removed from flights, many of them black or people of color. It was all there, in black and white. The airline had been quietly dealing with these complaints, but there was never any real follow-up. The reports were filed away, hidden from the public eye. Charles knew they had to act fast. The longer they waited, the more time the airline would have to cover up the truth. He called his lawyer again, this time more urgently. "We have the proof," he said. "We need to go public, but we need to be prepared. If we do this, there's no turning back." The lawyer agreed. "We'll set up a press conference and start reaching out to other victims. The media's already interested in your story, but we need to make sure we have all our facts straight. We don't want to make any mistakes." Charles wasn't afraid of the backlash anymore. In fact, the more he thought about it, the more he realized how much this meant, not just for him, but for all the people who had been wronged by the airline. He had become the face of something much bigger than a single incident, and now it was time to make sure his voice, and the voices of others, were heard. Over the next few days, Charles and Lisa reached out to people who had similar stories to share. Some of them were passengers who had been removed from flights under questionable circumstances. Others were former employees who had witnessed or even participated in the discriminatory practices. One by one, they came forward, each of them sharing their own painful experiences, adding pieces to a puzzle that was beginning to look more and more like a deliberate pattern of abuse. Charles had a feeling this was going to be bigger than anything he had ever imagined, but he was ready. He was tired of being quiet, tired of being ignored, and now he was more determined than ever to see this through. The press conference was set for the following Monday, just a few days after they had gathered all the evidence. Charles felt a knot in his stomach as the day approached. He had been nervous about standing in front of reporters before, but now, this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. He was about to stand up for everyone who had ever been mistreated by the airline, and that thought gave him the courage he needed to push through his fear. When the day finally arrived, the room was filled with reporters, cameras, and microphones. Charles stood at the front, flanked by Lisa and a few of the other passengers who had agreed to share their stories. The air was thick with anticipation. Charles could feel his heart racing, but he knew it was time. He stepped up to the podium, cleared his throat, and began. "Thank you all for being here today. What I'm about to tell you isn't just my story. It's the story of countless others who have been mistreated, pushed aside, and silenced by this airline. I am here today not just for myself, but for all of them." As Charles spoke, he could feel the weight of the moment. His words were steady, but filled with the passion and determination that had been building inside him for days. He didn't just want to expose the airline. He wanted to make sure they paid for what they had done. He talked about his experience, about how he had been unjustly removed from his seat without explanation. But he also talked about the bigger picture, the pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been quietly allowed to persist for far too long. As he spoke, Lisa shared her own story, detailing the internal practices she had witnessed while working for the airline. She talked about how employees had been instructed to target certain passengers, to report minor infractions, and to make sure those passengers didn't rock the boat. It wasn't just a few rogue individuals. This was a systemic issue that had been allowed to fester under the surface. The room was silent as they spoke, reporters scribbling down notes, cameras flashing. Charles could see the shock on their faces, but it wasn't just surprise. It was anger. People had been turning a blind eye to this for years, but now the truth was out in the open. There was no denying it. When the press conference ended, Charles felt a sense of relief. The truth was finally out there. But he knew this was only the beginning. The real battle had just begun. The airline would do everything in its power to cover up the damage, to spin the story in their favor. But Charles wasn't going to let them. He was in this for the long haul, and he was ready to take on whatever came next. The aftermath of the press conference was swift, and the effects were immediate. Within hours, the airline's public relations team scrambled to issue a statement, but it was clear from their words that they were trying to downplay the situation. "We regret the recent misunderstanding and are committed to resolving this matter. Our goal is to provide all passengers with the best experience possible," the statement read, completely ignoring the deeper issues Charles had revealed. It didn't take long for social media to pick up on the airline's weak response. Hashtags like discrimination, exposed, and airline fail began trending, as thousands of people online shared their opinions about what they had just learned. The airline tried to put out a few fires, but it was clear that their attempts were half-hearted at best. People weren't buying the narrative they were trying to sell. Charles, however, wasn't letting up. The media coverage was still building, and the public's outrage was growing by the hour. News outlets were running follow-up stories, digging deeper into the practices of the airline, and reaching out to even more former employees and passengers who had been mistreated. Some had already come forward on their own. Others were now contacting Charles directly, eager to share their stories. Each new account painted a darker picture of the airline's operations. As the weeks went on, the airline's attempts to quell the storm grew more desperate. They released another statement claiming they had retrained their staff, but this only sparked further outrage. The public wasn't satisfied with vague promises of reform. They wanted accountability. People began demanding that the airline fire the employees involved and take real steps to prevent future incidents. Charles and his team kept the pressure on. They set up interviews with major networks, gave statements to newspapers, and pushed for a full investigation. It became clear that the public wasn't going to let the airline sweep this under the rug. More whistleblowers came forward, and the evidence kept piling up. Charles's fight had become a national conversation about corporate responsibility and discrimination in the airline industry. At one point, Charles received a phone call from a prominent journalist who had been covering the story. "We've got your back," the journalist said. "This is huge. People are calling for a boycott. There's talk of a congressional hearing into the airline's practices. You've got the power to bring this company to its knees." The thought made Charles pause for a moment. He had never imagined his actions would lead to something like this. At first, he had just wanted answers for himself. He'd never dreamed he'd be part of something so much bigger. But now, as he heard the reporter's words, he realized that the battle was far from over. If anything, it was just starting. But even with all the support and the growing momentum, Charles knew that they still needed more. The airline was powerful, and they weren't going to give up their profits without a fight. Charles had to find a way to make sure they couldn't escape the consequences. It wasn't just about making noise. It was about ensuring real, lasting change. Then, just as things began to heat up, he received an unexpected call from an unknown number. He answered hesitantly, and the voice on the other end was familiar. The voice of Sarah, the flight attendant who had kicked him off the plane that day. "Mr. Williams, it's Sarah. I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I need you to hear me out," she said, her voice soft, almost pleading. Charles didn't know what to think. The last thing he expected was for Sarah to reach out to him. After everything that had happened, after all the accusations, why would she contact him now? Was she trying to save herself? "I'm listening," Charles said, his tone guarded. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," Sarah said. There was a long pause. "I didn't agree with what happened that day, but I didn't feel like I had a choice. They pressured me, and I was afraid of losing my job." Charles felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. She was apologizing? After everything that had gone down? He had heard stories about employees being forced to follow orders, but this was the first time someone had admitted it to him. It was a strange moment. His anger didn't fade, but there was something humanizing about the admission. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I'm not proud of what I did," she continued. "I don't want to be part of that system anymore. I just wanted to tell you that." There was a brief silence before Charles spoke again. "I don't know what to say, but I appreciate you reaching out. As he hung up the phone, Charles couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The apology didn't erase what had happened, but it was the first real acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done. It was a small step, but it was something, and with that, Charles knew. He couldn't stop now. The fight wasn't over, but he had more fuel than ever to push forward. The airline had underestimated him, thinking they could silence his voice. They were wrong, and now he had the support, the truth, and the momentum to see this through to the end. The story of Charles and the airline had become impossible to ignore. Every day, new developments made headlines, and public opinion was turning against the company faster than anyone could have predicted. But despite the mounting pressure, the airline's executives were still trying to spin the narrative. They issued more statements, promising reforms and claiming that they were committed to better training for their staff. But it was too little, too late. The public had seen the cracks in their story. People weren't satisfied with empty promises. They wanted action. Charles knew the battle was far from over, and with each passing day, the stakes got higher. It wasn't just about his own experience anymore. It was about making sure the airline paid for its systemic issues. If the company was going to change, it needed to be held accountable, not just in the court of public opinion, but in the courts of law. Charles and his lawyer began preparing a lawsuit. They had enough evidence now to take things to the next level. But just as they were ready to file, another unexpected twist came their way. One morning, Charles received an email from an anonymous source, someone claiming to be a former high-level employee at the airline. The subject line was simple: "You need to see this." The email contained an attachment, a series of emails between senior managers and flight crew members, discussing strategies on how to handle difficult passengers. As Charles skimmed through the messages, his stomach sank. They weren't just talking about difficult passengers. They were specifically discussing how to handle passengers of color. The emails detailed methods to deal with what they referred to as problematic customers, and gave instructions to be extra vigilant when certain individuals boarded flights. The language was coded, but the meaning was clear. It was systemic racism, disguised as customer service protocol. Charles felt his blood run cold. This was the smoking gun he had been looking for. These weren't just a few isolated incidents. This was a company-wide practice that had been allowed to persist for years. He forwarded the emails to his lawyer, and they immediately began working on their legal strategy. The plan was to make this information public, but they needed to be strategic about it. If they went too fast, they risked giving the airline a chance to bury the story. Charles wanted the world to see the truth, every detail, every document. He knew the power of public opinion, but he also knew that the courts would be the final battleground. Within the next few days, Charles and his team set up a press conference to release the emails. They were ready to blow the lid off this entire operation. The media was already following the story closely, and now they had the evidence to back it up. The night before the conference, Charles barely slept. His mind raced with thoughts of what was about to unfold. He knew the pressure was mounting, but he also felt more certain than ever that this was the right thing to do. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every passenger who had been unjustly treated by this airline, and every employee who had been forced to cover up the truth. The day of the press conference arrived, and as Charles stood in front of the podium, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Cameras flashed, reporters eagerly awaited their chance to ask questions, and Charles took a deep breath before speaking. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "What I'm about to show you is not just about one incident on one flight. This is the reality that many people face every day when they fly with this airline. What you're about to see are internal documents that reveal a troubling pattern of racial discrimination within the company. These are emails that were exchanged between high-level employees and flight crew members, discussing how to target and mistreat certain passengers based on the color of their skin." The room went silent. Charles could see the reporters exchange glances, their faces a mix of disbelief and shock. He opened the first email on the screen behind him, and the room collectively gasped as they read the messages for themselves. The emails painted a picture of an airline that had systematically mistreated passengers of color. There were instructions to profile and scrutinize certain passengers more closely, to make them feel uncomfortable, and to find any excuse to remove them from the flight. It wasn't just an isolated issue. It was a culture within the airline that encouraged discrimination. Charles paused for a moment to let the weight of the emails sink in. The journalists were furiously taking notes, and the cameras were rolling. The story was no longer just about his personal experience. It was about a systemic issue that affected hundreds, maybe thousands of passengers over the years. This is not just a few rogue employees making bad decisions, Charles continued, his voice rising with emotion. This is an entire system that is designed to make people feel unsafe and unwelcome. And it has to stop. This isn't just about me. This is about all the people who have been unfairly treated, and who, like me, were too afraid to speak out. We've been silenced for too long. The room erupted into questions, but Charles was resolute. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity anymore. He was fighting for the dignity of everyone who had been treated this way, and for the people who would continue to be mistreated unless something changed. As the press conference ended and the reporters swarmed, Charles felt a sense of victory. This was the moment when the truth had been exposed. He had fought back, and now it was up to the world to see if the airline would finally be held accountable. But Charles knew that the fight wasn't over. The airline would try to discredit him, try to blame the few employees who were involved. But he was ready. He wasn't going to back down, no matter what. The public had seen the truth. Now it was time for the airline to face the consequences. The following days were a blur of media coverage, public outrage, and legal maneuvering. Charles found himself constantly in front of cameras, answering questions, giving interviews, and standing firm as the face of a movement. The public's anger was palpable, and the pressure on the airline was reaching a boiling point. People who had been silent for years were finally speaking out, sharing their own stories of being mistreated or unfairly targeted by the airline. It was as if a dam had broken, and the flood of complaints and accusations seemed unstoppable. The airline's top executives were desperately trying to control the narrative, but they were struggling. They issued yet another apology, this time pledging to restructure their policies and offer sensitivity training to their employees. But Charles wasn't fooled. He had seen enough to know that these weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a larger, deeply ingrained issue. A few policy changes and some vague promises wouldn't be enough to erase the damage they had caused. Charles had one goal now: accountability. He wasn't interested in vague assurances or half-hearted apologies. He wanted the airline to face the consequences of its actions, and he wasn't going to let them get away with it. He knew that the legal battle was just beginning. His lawyer had already filed the initial lawsuit, and now it was time to start gathering even more evidence. The company was trying to bury the truth, but Charles had more than just social media on his side now. The truth was in the court documents, and he was going to make sure it came to light. The media storm raged on, and then came the bombshell. A former senior manager at the airline, someone with direct knowledge of the company's discriminatory practices, agreed to testify. The whistleblower, who wished to remain anonymous, had worked for the airline for over a decade and had first-hand knowledge of the tactics used by the airline's leadership to target passengers of color. This was the evidence that could potentially bring down the entire system. Charles met with the whistleblower in a secure location, away from the prying eyes of the media. The whistleblower was a middle-aged man, his face weary but determined. He had seen too much during his time at the airline, and he couldn't stay silent anymore. "I was part of the team that created the internal guidelines," the whistleblower said, his voice low but steady. "I wasn't the one who put the policies into practice, but I saw them being implemented. The higher-ups didn't just condone racial profiling, they encouraged it. They wanted us to target passengers based on their appearance, their behavior, and especially their race. They told us to make sure those passengers were either removed from flights or made to feel uncomfortable enough that they wouldn't want to fly with us again." Charles felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected that this wasn't just a few rogue employees acting on their own, but hearing it from someone who had been directly involved was another thing entirely. This was a coordinated effort, a culture within the airline that had been allowed to flourish for years. The whistleblower continued. Every time there was a complaint about a passenger, no matter how minor it was flagged, if they were a person of color, it was almost automatically assumed that they were the problem. We were told to keep an eye on them, report any infractions, and if necessary, get them removed from the flight. It didn't matter if the complaint was legitimate or not. It was all about making the customers who fit a certain profile feel unwelcome. Charles felt sick, but at the same time he knew that this was the breakthrough they needed. The evidence was damning, and now they had someone who could back up everything he had been saying all along. The whistleblower's testimony would be a game changer. It wasn't just Charles's word against the airlines anymore. Now they had an insider, someone who had been part of the system and had witnessed it firsthand. With this new information, Charles's team quickly filed an amended lawsuit, including the whistleblower's testimony. They also reached out to more media outlets, ensuring that this new development was shared with the world. The press conference was set for the following week, and Charles knew that this would be the turning point. As the media picked up on the new information, the backlash against the airline intensified. Protests began to break out at airports across the country, with passengers demanding change and holding signs calling for the company to be held accountable. Social media exploded once again, and this time, the hashtag number "No More Discrimination" was trending worldwide. The airline, meanwhile, was scrambling. They had no idea how to respond to the mounting pressure. The CEO held a press conference, trying to downplay the allegations, but it was clear that the damage had been done. The public wasn't buying the company's claims of reform. They wanted action, and they wanted it now. Charles, though, remained focused. He knew that this was the critical moment. He couldn't afford to let up. He had already come this far, and he wasn't going to stop until the airline was forced to face the full extent of its actions. He was no longer just a passenger fighting for his rights. He was now the leader of a movement, one that was fighting for justice, for accountability, and for the millions of people who had been silenced for too long. The real battle was just beginning. The momentum Charles had built seemed unstoppable. Each day brought more people into the fold, victims of the airline's discriminatory practices, former employees, and even passengers who had previously been too afraid to speak out. The more people shared their stories, the more it became clear. This wasn't just an isolated problem, and it wasn't going to go away quietly. As Charles prepared for the next wave of legal action, the tension was palpable. The airline, now fighting to keep its reputation intact, was doing everything it could to undermine the public's perception of the case. They brought in high-powered lawyers, flooded the media with their own counter-narratives, and tried to paint Charles as a disgruntled passenger who was simply looking for a payout. But Charles knew this wasn't just about money. It was about holding a corporation accountable for the harm it had done to countless people over the years. The pressure was mounting on the airline's leadership, and it was clear they were starting to crack. The CEO, who had initially tried to distance himself from the controversy, was now forced to answer tough questions in interviews. His answers were vague, and his apologies were increasingly hollow. Behind the scenes, Charles knew the company was scrambling to come up with a solution that would protect its bottom line without facing any real consequences. But nothing they did could put the genie back in the bottle. The truth was out, and it was spreading faster than they could control. Then a breakthrough came. One of the former employees who had reached out to Charles, someone who had worked as a senior manager in the customer service department, contacted him with startling new information. This employee, who had been with the airline for nearly 15 years, had uncovered an internal document that showed how the airline had knowingly targeted minority passengers as part of a customer profiling strategy. The document included lists of passengers who had been flagged for potential issues based solely on their appearance and race. It was a blueprint for discrimination, and it was damning. Charles felt a mixture of disbelief and fury as he read the document. The scale of the operation was worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just isolated incidents. It was a systematic practice that had been going on for years, and it had been condoned at the highest levels of the company. The document made it clear that this wasn't the result of a few rogue employees acting on their own. It was policy, and now Charles had the evidence to prove it. He forwarded the document to his lawyer immediately, and they began preparing for the next big step, taking this new evidence public. This time, they weren't just going to expose one or two bad actors. They were going to show the world that the airline had built its operations on a foundation of racial profiling and discrimination. But with the new information came a new set of challenges. The airline, sensing that the walls were closing in, started launching a full-scale campaign to discredit Charles. They hired public relations firms to flood social media with counter-arguments, claiming that the documents were forged or taken out of context. They even went so far as to try and paint Charles as an opportunist who was using this incident to further his own agenda. Charles knew this would happen. He had seen it before. Corporations trying to deflect blame, trying to confuse the public with a sea of misinformation. But he wasn't going to back down. He had the truth on his side, and now he had the evidence to prove it. The whistleblower documents were clear, and the testimonies of former employees backed it up. The airline was fighting a losing battle, but they weren't going down without a fight. The public's outrage grew as more details emerged. Protests at airports became larger and more organized, with passengers chanting for justice and holding up signs demanding accountability. Some activists even staged fly-ins, where people intentionally booked flights just to sit and demand that the airline do better. Social media became a battleground, with people showing solidarity by sharing their own experiences of racial discrimination while flying. Charles continued to lead the charge, appearing on news outlets, engaging with supporters online, and holding regular meetings with his legal team. He knew that this fight wasn't just about making headlines. It was about changing the way the airline industry operated. It was about sending a message to every corporation that systemic racism would no longer be tolerated. The battle was no longer just his personal fight. It was a movement. Then came the day of the new press conference. Charles, standing at the podium with his legal team beside him, felt an overwhelming sense of resolve. Behind him, the document containing the damning evidence was projected on the screen for all to see. As the cameras flashed, Charles began to speak. "Thank you for joining us today. What I'm about to show you is the culmination of months of investigation and countless hours of work. These aren't just isolated incidents. These are company-wide policies that were designed to target and remove passengers based on nothing but the color of their skin." His voice didn't waver as he continued. "I've been told I should let this go, that we should accept their apologies and move on. But this isn't about me. This is about every person who has been mistreated, every person who has been targeted unfairly, every person who has ever been made to feel unwelcome simply because of the color of their skin." Charles paused and looked directly into the camera, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. This is bigger than one flight, bigger than one incident. This is about holding corporations accountable for their actions. It's about making sure that no one else has to face what I faced, or what countless others have faced, simply because of who they are. The room was silent, but there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. The truth was out. The airline could no longer deny it. The floodgates had opened, and there was no going back. Charles could feel the fight in him burning brighter than ever. It wasn't just about justice for himself anymore. It was about creating lasting change, about making sure this never happened again. As he walked off the stage, he knew the battle was far from over. But for the first time, he felt like he had the power to win. The immediate aftermath of the press conference was unlike anything Charles had experienced. The media storm intensified, and the public's anger toward the airline only grew stronger. Within hours, news outlets were dissecting the new evidence, and every major network had reporters covering the story. The hashtag #No More Discrimination was trending worldwide, and the story spread like wildfire across social media platforms. What had started as a personal grievance had now turned into a full-scale public reckoning. In the days following the release of the documents, the airline's stock began to plummet. Investors, sensing the growing scandal, started pulling out, and the company's public image took a huge hit. The CEO, who had tried to downplay the issue for so long, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight, forced to answer tough questions during televised interviews. His apologies, however, rang hollow. The public wasn't buying it anymore. A few hours of damage control weren't going to undo years of systemic abuse. Charles couldn't help but feel a small sense of vindication as he watched the fallout unfold. This was the moment he had fought for, the moment when the truth was undeniable. But he knew it wasn't over. The airline still had deep pockets and powerful connections, and they weren't going to go down without a fight. Charles also knew that his real battle was in the courts. The evidence was there, but he needed to make sure that the airline faced the full consequences of their actions. As his legal team worked tirelessly to build the case, Charles remained in the public eye. He gave more interviews, met with civil rights leaders, and continued to press for real, lasting change within the airline industry. He wasn't just fighting for his own justice anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been wronged by this airline, and for the countless others who faced discrimination on a daily basis. He knew this case could set a precedent for corporate accountability. If they could win this, it could force other companies to rethink their practices. But Charles wasn't naive. He knew that corporations had a way of weathering storms. The airline would fight tooth and nail to protect its profits and its reputation. The next step was crucial. They needed to ensure that the lawsuit would proceed, and that it would be impossible for the company to settle quietly behind closed doors. They needed to shine a light on the practices that had been hidden for so long. Then, as the legal battle began to take shape, the airline made an unexpected move. They offered Charles a settlement. The terms of the settlement weren't public at first, but Charles was immediately suspicious. It wasn't just money they were offering. It was a chance to make this all go away without going to trial. They promised him compensation, an apology from the CEO, and even some promises of future reform. But Charles wasn't interested in a payout. He didn't need their money, and he certainly didn't need their empty promises. When the offer came through, Charles was taken aback. He had expected them to dig in their heels to try and discredit him even further. But this was different. This was the company trying to take control of the narrative. They knew that if the case went to trial, the public would see the full extent of their wrongdoing. The internal documents, the testimonies from employees, the public outcry, all of it would be exposed, and there was no telling what further consequences the airline might face. Charles discussed the offer with his lawyer and the other activists supporting him. It wasn't an easy decision. The settlement would offer him a chance to move on with his life, and it would provide some much-needed resources to the legal team and the organizations that had supported him. But Charles wasn't in this for personal gain. He knew that taking the settlement could close the door on the larger issue at hand, the issue of systemic racism within the airline industry. In the end, Charles made his decision. He rejected the settlement. "I didn't start this fight for money," Charles said in a public statement. "I started this because what happened to me, and what continues to happen to others, is wrong. And I'm not going to let them buy their way out of it." His rejection of the settlement sent shockwaves through the media. The airline's desperate attempt to make the whole thing go away had backfired, and now the case was destined for trial. Charles felt a surge of determination as he made his decision public. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. With the rejection of the settlement, the case entered a new phase. The court dates were set, and Charles, along with his legal team, prepared for the battle ahead. They knew the stakes were high. If they won, it wouldn't just be a personal victory. It would be a landmark moment for corporate accountability, especially in the airline industry. But if they lost, it could send a chilling message that corporations could get away with systemic discrimination and exploitation, no matter how much evidence was presented. Charles wasn't going to let that happen. He doubled down on his commitment to the cause, speaking out even more fervently, rallying support from the public and other advocacy groups. Civil rights leaders joined the fight, and more people came forward with their own stories, strengthening the case and adding more weight to the argument that this wasn't just about one flight, one incident, or one company. It was about a systemic issue that had affected countless people over the years. The legal battle was intense. Both sides filed motions, submitted evidence, and prepared witnesses. Charles spent hours reviewing documents, meeting with his team, and organizing his thoughts for the courtroom. He knew he had to stay focused no matter how exhausting the process became. The airline's lawyers were going to throw everything they had at him, trying to discredit the evidence and make him out to be a liar. But Charles had something they didn't have: the truth. As the trial date approached, the media kept a watchful eye on the case. The attention was global now, and people all over the world were following every twist and turn. Protests continued at airports, with passengers demanding justice. Every day there were new stories, new faces, and new voices joining the cause. Charles had become a symbol not just for himself, but for every person who had been wronged by the system. The weight of it all was immense, but it also fueled his determination. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity anymore, he was fighting for something much bigger. On the day the trial began, Charles stood tall as he entered the courtroom, his legal team behind him, his supporters in the gallery. It felt surreal, but also empowering. The journey had been long, and it had been difficult, but he was no longer the same man who had been kicked off that plane months ago. He had become a leader in a movement, and today, that movement would go to court. As the first day of the trial unfolded, Charles felt a quiet confidence. The evidence was on his side. The witnesses were prepared, and the truth was undeniable. The battle was far from over, but as he looked around the courtroom, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop fighting until justice was served. The courtroom was filled with tension as the trial began. Charles sat at the plaintiff's table, his legal team beside him, while the airline's high-powered attorneys took their seats across the room. The media was buzzing with activity, reporters scribbling down every detail, the air thick with anticipation. Charles could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he remained focused. This was it, the fight for accountability, the fight for justice. The airline's defense strategy was clear from the start: deny, deflect, and discredit. They tried to downplay the seriousness of the allegations, insisting that the incidents were isolated cases of misunderstanding, not part of a broader pattern. They pointed to the airline's commitment to customer service and diversity training, claiming that any discrimination was the result of rogue employees acting outside of company policy. But Charles knew better. He had seen the documents, heard the testimonies, and felt the sting of injustice firsthand. This was a carefully orchestrated system of discrimination, and he wasn't about to let the airline get away with it. Over the next few weeks, the courtroom became a battleground. Both sides presented their evidence, and the case began to unfold in front of a rapt audience. Charles's legal team presented the damning internal documents, the testimonies of former employees, and the public's growing outrage as undeniable proof that the airline had been complicit in a pattern of racial discrimination. The whistleblower's testimony was key. An insider who had worked for the airline and could confirm that the practice of profiling certain passengers based on their race had been an accepted policy within the company. But the defense was relentless. They tried to poke holes in the evidence, to question the motivations of the whistleblower, and to cast doubt on the testimonies of former employees. They even tried to turn the tables, accusing Charles of exaggerating his own experience for personal gain, claiming that the real issue was a miscommunication that had gotten blown out of proportion. They attacked his credibility, painted him as a victim of his own ambition, and tried to distract from the core issue. But the public wasn't fooled. The courtroom, though tense, had become a stage for the truth to be revealed. Charles's calm and determined presence in the face of the airline's attacks only strengthened his resolve. The case was about more than just him. It was about exposing a culture of discrimination that had been allowed to thrive for far too long. The pressure on the airline was mounting, and Charles knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. After weeks of back-and-forth arguments, cross-examinations, and intense media scrutiny, the trial finally reached its climax. The closing arguments were scheduled, and both sides had one last chance to make their case. Charles, his lawyer, and the legal team had presented an overwhelming case, but the defense still had one final weapon: the airline's attempt to discredit the entire case as a public relations stunt. Charles's lawyer stepped up to give the final argument. He stood tall, his voice steady, and began with a simple but powerful statement. This case is about more than just the actions of one flight attendant. It's about the actions of an entire corporation that, for years, fostered an environment of racial profiling and discrimination. It's about the truth that the defendant has tried to hide with their statements, their distractions, and their denials. But the truth is now in front of you, and it's undeniable. He went on to recount the key pieces of evidence, stressing the consistency of the testimonies from former employees and passengers who had been unfairly treated. He highlighted the damning internal documents showing the airline's systemic practices of profiling, and he reminded the jury that the whistleblower had risked everything to come forward with the truth. This is not a case of one bad flight. This is a case of years of deliberate, harmful actions taken against people simply because of the color of their skin, he said. And this is a case that demands accountability. As Charles sat in the courtroom listening to his lawyer, he realized that the fight had reached a point of no return. His journey, from the moment he was removed from the plane, had brought him here, standing up for justice, for everyone who had ever been wronged, for everyone who had been silenced. And now it was in the hands of the jury. When the defense lawyer gave their closing arguments, it felt like a final attempt to salvage whatever dignity the airline had left. They argued that the airline had acted swiftly to address the situation, suspended the flight attendant, and pledged reforms. But they couldn't deny the weight of the evidence or the public outcry. The jury could see it. The airline's actions weren't just an accident. They were the result of an entrenched culture of discrimination. The jury deliberated for just under 2 days. When they finally returned to the courtroom, the tension was unbearable. Charles could feel his heart racing as the foreman stood and read the verdict aloud. We find the defendant, XYZ Airlines, guilty of systematic racial discrimination. The airline is hereby ordered to pay punitive damages and undergo an independent review of its policies and practices, including mandatory sensitivity training for all employees at all levels. The room erupted into a mix of gasps and applause. Charles felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he also knew this was only part of the battle. The win in court was monumental, but the fight for change was ongoing. The verdict wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for every person who had been mistreated, for every passenger who had been unjustly targeted, for every employee who had witnessed the injustice but was too afraid to speak out. In the days following the verdict, the media continued to cover the aftermath of the trial. The airline, stunned by the loss, issued a public apology, vowing to implement the court's recommendations and make significant changes to its policies. But many critics were skeptical. They knew that true change couldn't be forced through a statement or a few reforms. It had to come from within. Charles, though, wasn't concerned with the airline's words. He had achieved his goal. The truth had been exposed, and the public had seen the extent of the wrongdoing. The airline was now forced to confront the consequences of its actions, and that alone was a victory. But Charles also knew that the work wasn't done. There would be no end to the fight until real, lasting change had been made across the industry. He wasn't going to let up, not now. A few months later, Charles was invited to speak at a major civil rights conference. He stood before a packed audience sharing his journey, from the moment he was kicked off that flight to the courtroom where he had faced down a corporate giant. He spoke not just about his own experiences, but about the collective power of those who stand together to demand justice. This victory is not just mine, he said. It's ours. It's the victory of every person who has ever been unfairly treated, of every person who has been silenced and ignored. This is what happens when we refuse to stay quiet, when we refuse to accept the status quo. The room erupted in applause, and in that moment Charles knew that his fight had been worth it. The movement he had sparked wasn't over. It was just beginning. And as the crowd stood and cheered, Charles felt a sense of peace. He had fought for justice, he had fought for change, and he had won. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.